The aroma of coffee beans at exactly 6 in the morning used to be the scent of my devotion, a fragrant promise I made to a man who once looked at me as if I were the sun itself. For 47 years, I have navigated the narrow hallway of our home with the precision of a ghost, placing a ceramic mug on a coaster that has sat in the same spot since 1979. 2 sugars, no milk. It is a recipe etched into my DNA, a silent ritual of service that has outlived our passion, our arguments, and eventually our conversation. My husband, Arthur, drinks it while staring at the morning news, his eyes never drifting toward the woman who just curated his comfort. He doesn't see the way my hands tremble slightly now, nor does he notice that I've stopped wearing the perfume he once loved because he hasn't commented on it in a decade. This isn't a story of a broken home or a scandalous affair. Those are loud tragedies that people can understand and fix. My story is about the quiet erosion of a soul, the slow tectonic shift where one person becomes furniture in their own life. I remember a time when we were a symphony of shared dreams, where a look across a crowded room was a complete sentence. Now the silence between us is a heavy, physical thing, a thick fog that has settled in the corners of our living room. I am not angry, because anger requires energy I no longer possess. Instead, I am hollow. I look in the mirror and see a woman who has spent nearly half a century perfecting the art of being invisible so that his life could remain seamless. I have become a master of the background, a curator of his preferences, while my own desires have been packed away in boxes in the attic of my mind. It is a dangerous kind of loneliness because it looks like peace from the outside. Our neighbors see a devoted couple walking hand in hand, but they don't feel the coldness of his grip or the way I am screaming internally for just one moment of genuine recognition. I realized today, as the steam rose from his cup, that I am not waiting for him to love me anymore. I am waiting for the version of myself that existed before I became 2 sugars, no milk. The disappearance is almost complete, and the most terrifying part is that he hasn't even noticed I'm gone. The weight of the silence became unbearable during our anniversary dinner, a milestone that should have celebrated nearly 5 decades of shared history, but instead served as a stark inventory of everything we had lost. We sat in a booth at the same restaurant we visited for 20 years, the candlelight flickering between us like a dying pulse. I watched him study the menu with more intensity than he had studied my face in years, and a sudden sharp realization pierced my chest. He no longer knew who I was. If he were asked my favorite book or the fear that keeps me awake at 3 a.m., he would offer a blank stare or a guess based on who I was in 1985. I have evolved, aged, and withered in the shade of his indifference. Yet to him I am a static photograph, a domestic constant that requires no maintenance. I tried to speak, to bridge the chasm with a memory of our first house, but he merely nodded and checked his watch, wondering if we'd make it home in time for the weather report. That night, I lay awake listening to the rhythmic cadence of his breathing, feeling like a stowaway in my own marriage. I began to think about the dislike people talk about in long marriages. It isn't a burning hatred, but a cold, hard resentment that forms when you realize you've sacrificed your entire identity to fuel someone else's comfort. I started to notice the small things that grated on my nerves, the way he cleared his throat, his refusal to ask me a single question about my day, and the assumption that my time was perpetually his to command. These weren't character flaws. They were the symptoms of a man who had stopped seeing his wife as a person and started seeing her as a utility. I found myself wandering into the guest room, touching the dusty linens and wondering what it would be like to sleep in a bed where I didn't have to shrink myself to fit into the margins. The emotional connection hadn't just snapped, it had frayed fiber by fiber until only a single fragile thread remained. I wasn't just losing my husband, I was losing the memory of who I was supposed to be before I became an extension of him. The house felt like a museum of a life I no longer recognized, and every polished surface reflected back a woman I didn't want to be anymore. There was no grand explosion, no cinematic confrontation where I threw plates or packed a suitcase in the middle of the night. Instead, there was a Tuesday morning where I simply didn't make the coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands folded, watching the clock tick past 6. When Arthur walked in, his confusion was palpable, not because he was worried about me, but because his routine had been disrupted. He looked at the empty countertop and then at me, asking where his drink was with a tone of mild inconvenience. In that moment, the last thread snapped. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the stranger I had been serving for 47 years. I told him quietly that the kitchen was open and he was welcome to use it, and then I walked out into the garden to feel the sun on my skin. It was the first time in decades I had prioritized my own warmth over his schedule. The dislike people see in older wives is often just the final stage of grief, the mourning of a partnership that turned into a solo performance. I began to reclaim the small territories of my life, buying the bread I liked, listening to the music he found annoying, and spending hours in the library reconnecting with the thoughts I had suppressed. We still live in the same house, and I still care for him in the way one cares for a long-time companion, but the emotional servitude has ended. He is slowly learning that I am a person with a landscape of my own, though I fear it may be too late for the intimacy we once had to bloom again. I tell my story not to discourage, but to warn. A marriage can survive a storm, but it rarely survives a drought of the soul. To the women who feel themselves disappearing, I say this: do not wait until you are a ghost to start living again. The sugar and the milk were never the point. The point was whether or not he ever truly asked if I was thirsty too. Now I make my own cup, and for the first time in nearly half a century, I am savoring every single drop of my own presence, finding the woman I thought I had lost forever in the quiet, beautiful strength of my own independence.